Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Bill Wohlforth, and I teach in the Department of Government here at Dartmouth College, and it's my great pleasure to introduce to you today's Leading Voices speaker. And one thing I'm acutely conscious of while I stand up here is that you're all sitting in this room and sitting in those chairs not eagerly anticipating listening to me, but rather you are here for our speaker. So I'll only make one self-reference, which is that I've been studying these issues of war and peace and U.S. foreign policy and military policy for a long time. And one thing I've noticed is that every time I go to get a haircut or interact with the regular person on the street, they say, well, what do you do for a living? And I'll say, well, I study international security questions. And they'll say, well, now must be a particularly fascinating time for that subject. And that's been true for the last 30 years that I've been studying this subject. But in some sense, I want to suggest to you that today is a particularly propitious moment, a particularly interesting moment, to hear the thoughts of someone with the expertise of today's guest. Just when we thought we were getting used to novel and new security challenges, just when we thought we'd kind of accommodated the post-Cold War realities of super-empowered individuals and transnational networks, along comes a new, very difficult to grasp kind of security challenge, namely cybersecurity issues. And I can think truly of few, if any, people better qualified to address us on this new and interesting subject than William Lynn. Bill Lynn is a graduate of the Dartmouth class of 1976 with a degree in history. And he went on to further study at Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School and received a degree of law from Cornell University, and then went on to have a multifarious, deep, and distinguished career, which he's, of course, still engaged in America's defense, working both in the really in all three branches of the defense world in the United States government. The Congress, working for Senator Ted Kennedy back in the 1980s, working in the private sector for major U.S. defense firms. He is now the CEO of DRS Technologies, a major defense contractor. He worked for the Pentagon in the executive branch twice during the administrations of Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, most recently rising to the level of Deputy Secretary of Defense, the second highest position in the largest single agency of the United States government, working with Secretary of Defense Bob Gates at a time of dramatic transformation and challenge for America's national security. So, with that, by way of introduction, I hope you'll join me in welcoming to the podium Bill Lynn.
Thanks very much, Bill, for that nice introduction. It's great to be back at Dartmouth. As Bill said, I was here, graduated in 1976. A couple of things have changed since then. Back then, we were pretty impressed with the new kinds of phones that had new kinds of clocks that had digital numbers instead of the Mickey's big hand and Mickey's little hand to tell time. Now students wake up to iPhone alarms, I think. And when I was here, there was this Kiewit Center. I noticed walking by, it's long gone, but it was the computer center for the Dartmouth, which was actually fairly advanced in the era. And I think most of the laptops the students are walking around with now have more computing power than that entire building. Of course, then when I came for a summer term, there were a few more parties in the summer term than there were in the other. Well, maybe some things haven't changed. As Bill said, I was honored to have been the Deputy Secretary of Defense and had the privilege of working each day alongside incredibly dedicated men and women of the United States Armed Forces. I was constantly in awe of their dedication and their selflessness. So also in the position as deputy, you did get a few perks. I did have a couple of black SUVs that took me around, and we could kind of go through stoplights and get through traffic, and that that sounds good, except I'd suggest the students at Dartmouth now might feel a little constrained if they had a 24/7 security detail. It would dent your ability, I think, to go to parties. Our dog, Clancy, a golden retriever, particularly didn't like it because she thought it was her job to protect us. My 5-year-old daughter, though, thought it was a better deal because she thought it ought to be a trade. She would tell the security team that now it's time to change, and she was going to follow them. And then finally, at the local Starbucks, things may not be the same because each morning I'd roar in the SUVs. Everybody'd kind of turn, figuring there's going to be somebody famous at the Starbucks, and we're somewhat disappointed to find me behind them in line, waiting again for my mocha. If the First Lady ever sneaks into Starbucks in sunglasses, I don't think anybody's going to notice because they've just been burned too many times. They do not expect someone famous now when the black SUVs come up. What I'd like to center my talk on today is a subject that I think is important to everyone in this room. If you have a checking account or access to any form of online service, you're a potential victim. According to a cybercrime report by the Norton Company, some 431 million people were victims of cybercrime in the past year. And over the course of their lifetime, more than 2/3 of the population are going to have some incident affecting them in terms of cyber. And individuals between the ages of 18 and 31 who do online services through their phones are the most likely to have a problem. So many of the people in this room are right in the target group. But what I want to talk about today is not the threat to individuals, not the basically criminal threat, but I want to talk about the threat to the country. There are few entities that get the kind of challenge that the Department of Defense has. There are few entities that have a greater number of attacks and a more sophisticated type of attack than the Pentagon feels today. If you think for a minute about the overarching threats that cyber warfare poses, you'll see three, I think. There's the threat to our technological competitiveness from the rampant and increasing theft of our most important intellectual property. There's the threat to our military superiority from asymmetric challenges that potential adversaries can use cyber capabilities to pose. And there's the threat to our critical infrastructure from destructive attacks on our power grid, our transportation networks, our financial system, or our telecommunications backbone. Let me consider them one at a time, starting with the threat of theft of intellectual property. Now, nations have always stolen each other's technologies and military secrets. We're not innocent here. In the early industrial age, Britain used to complain vociferously about its manufacturing secrets being stolen by Germany and the United States. Later in the nuclear age, the Soviet Union stole the plans for atomic weapons from us. But in the past, there was a significant lag from when information was stolen to when a new product based on it could be developed. Such a time lag provided an important level of protection for the originator of the technology. But the issue has changed with the advent of cyber technology. It's increased the speed and the volume of data that can be taken and transferred, often without any knowledge. It's no longer possible to expect the buffer of time lags between the time of the theft and the product introduction, especially when the data itself may be that final product. Intrusions at the IMF, at Citibank, now join those in the oil and gas sector, at Google, NASDAQ, and others, all represent troubling attempts to chip away at the strength of our institutions in key sectors. Even companies employing sophisticated defenses have fallen victim to intrusions that have compromised services and stolen important intellectual property. As a result of this escalating set of cyber vulnerabilities, we must take far more seriously the current generation of threats to military and industrial technology. According to the World Customs Organization, Intellectual property theft costs business more than $600 billion annually and 750,000 jobs. And the fastest growing segment of intellectual property theft involves cyber. To address the threat, the U.S. and our allies need to fully employ a range of tools, trade, diplomatic, and ultimately military, to halt this hemorrhaging of technology. Of course, the impact of information technology is omnipresent. It has radically transformed everything it has come in contact with, and that's doubly so for the military. Over the past 2 centuries, we've seen modern warfare transformed 3 times. It's first transformed by the industrial age, then by the advent of atomic energy, and now it's being reshaped in fundamental ways by the information age. Information technology has transformed the nature of warfare in more fundamental ways, I would argue, than tanks or airplanes. Today's cyberspace is now the 5th domain of warfare. It is just as critical to our military effectiveness as our ability to control the other 4 domains: land, sea, air, and space. Information technology lies at the core of our most important military capabilities, giving us the ability to communicate with certainty, to navigate with accuracy, to see the battlefield with clarity, and to strike with precision. Information technology has multiplied the potency of new and existing platforms, further increasing the substantial advantages the U.S. military holds. Yet the price to be paid for this increased capability has been to introduce new vulnerabilities as well. If adversaries have the ability to compromise our networks, they could rapidly degrade our capabilities by blinding our satellites, by jamming our communications, by fouling our logistics, or making smart bombs dumb again. Meanwhile, the challenges and opportunities of asymmetric warfare are not lost on other nations' militaries, many of whom are developing world-class cyber capabilities of their own, further complicating the challenge for the United States. In the face of all these compounding threats, the only responsible thing to do is act and use all of our resources. We must ensure that cyber networks have the highest possible protections. We must ensure that our military is able to act with a range of options, even in a degraded cyber environment. We must have a rapid ability to restore capabilities when they've been compromised. And we must have the ability to strike back. Because no defense will be perfect, such offensive cyber capabilities can act as a deterrent, just as our nuclear arsenal did for so long and continues to do. This capability is particularly important to deter other nations from directing a cyber attack on our critical infrastructure, since they can expect that they'll see an equal or more devastating response. Over the past 2 years, the United States has deployed specialized active defenses to protect military networks. As a doctrinal matter, our forces must be able to operate freely in cyberspace. The U.S. Cyber Command has established an ability to do just that and an ability to operate and defend our networks. At the Lisbon Summit in 2010, NATO recognized the need to elevate its treatment of network security as a leading priority in the 21st century. As a result, upgrades are underway to enable NATO to defend its networks, and my company is involved in helping NATO do just that. Now, this brings us to the final major cyber threat, which is the potential for destructive attacks on critical infrastructure. Over the past decade, we have seen an escalation in the harmfulness of cyber attacks. Up to this point in time, the most prevalent form of cyber attack has been the exploitation of networks. By that I mean the theft of data from both government and industry. As I indicated earlier, over the long term, this may be the most serious threat to our national security and our economic competitiveness because of the impact to that economy. But what is potentially more compelling in the near term is the fact that in the last few years, a second type of cyber threat has emerged: disruption of networks. This is where intruders seek to deny or degrade the use of important government or commercial networks. Examples of this include the denial of service attacks against Estonia in 2007 and against the state of Georgia in 2008. But to this point, these disruptive attacks have been relatively unsophisticated in nature, largely reversible, and short in duration. In the future, more capable adversaries could potentially immobilize networks on a wider scale for a longer period of time, and the effects may not be reversible. But the most dangerous form of cyber attack, in which cyber weapons are used to cause actual damage to structures, to systems, even to people, lurk on the horizon. This development is only now emerging, but it marks a strategic shift in the nature of the cyber threat. When you consider the availability of tools, it is clear that such a destructive capability exists right now and could be used to cripple critical infrastructure. It could be used against the transportation system, the financial network, or the energy sector. It could cause severe economic loss, financial hardship, and it could cause physical destruction or the loss of life. Now, if you think this threat is overblown, consider that few weapons ever developed, once created, haven't been used. The harsh reality is that the range of cyber threats have been moving up the ladder from theft and the exploitation of information to the disruption of services and potentially now to the destruction of physical property and the loss of life. At the same time, we are migrating from a world in which cyber warfare once was a capability that was limited to major nation states. We're now moving to a world in which those capabilities could migrate to rogue states or even terrorist groups. It's a reality that these rogue states and terrorists are far more likely to use cyber weapons against the United States than any major nation state. So today we stand at an important crossroads. The most malicious actors have not yet acquired the most harmful capabilities, but it's only a matter of time before they do. As such, we have a window of opportunity of uncertain length to protect our networks against the most perilous threats. Precisely because terrorist groups or rogue states could obtain and use destructive cyber weapons, the United States and its allies must leverage the entire engine of creativity and innovation to outpace this threat. Our freedom of creativity and technological ingenuity must again elevate us to the challenge. And institutions like Dartmouth can help lead the way. Our challenge is to develop defenses before destructive threats become a reality. Now, let me conclude by outlining what I think we need to do inside this window of opportunity, and then let me turn it over to you for questions. Defending our critical infrastructure will require more than just perimeter defenses like firewalls and intrusion detection systems. We must extend our active defenses to critical infrastructure as well as to military networks. And by active defenses, I mean those that assume that some level of penetration is inevitable. Think maneuver warfare instead of the Maginot Line. Such active defenses enable us to hunt on our own networks, use more sophisticated techniques to divert attacks, and allow us to use intelligence capabilities to anticipate and deflect the type and pattern of attacks and then deflect them. All of these elements of an active defense, especially the call for enhanced intelligence capabilities, requires the government and private industry to partner in the defense of our critical infrastructure. A cyber defense cannot be constructed by the government alone, nor does private industry have all the tools it needs to conduct a robust defense. We need joint public-private efforts to defend critical infrastructure. We need better information sharing on cyber threats as they materialize across federal, state, local, and private institutions. We need joint research to improve cybersecurity in the long term by reducing the inherent advantages that the attackers now enjoy throughout the internet. Which brings us right back to where we started, with the point that the threat of cyber attack involves all of us. Just as the internet has changed our way of life and transformed or eliminated some institutions and businesses, so too must it change now how we protect ourselves individually and collectively. The information technology revolution came along and simplified many aspects of our lives, but it's also complicated many others. So we have to keep the scales in balance. Thank you for having me today. I've enjoyed coming back to the campus, have great memories of my time at Dartmouth. If the caliber of the students that I've met in the class that we just participated in is any indication, the future of our nation is in very good hands. Thank you. I guess there are microphones around. If you could signal, and of course with the lights I can't see. Okay. How about right in the back there?
Is there any consideration being given by the political echelons in our nation to adopt the Iranian model of taking out these cyber threats before they become real, like in Iran?
Well, I think that what you see today in terms of the government is a balance between the development of defensive capabilities, which is what you hear most about, and offensive capabilities, which is going on, but you don't hear much about. So I think what you want to have is a balanced set of tools. You want the U.S. to continue to be the most capable actor in this realm on both the offensive and defensive side. In terms of your specific question as to whether we should make a decision to preemptively move, that's the same kind of decision in cyber as it would be in any aspect of conflict. You have to balance the precedent, you have to balance the impingement on sovereignty against the risks that you might face if you don't do it, and it's a similar calculus. It's a difficult calculus. The U.S. does not often act with preemption, but it retains that option if it needs that to defend itself. Sir?
First of all, thank you very much for coming here. It's been an interesting talk. I have a question about your apparent reference to what seems to be a doctrine of mutual assured destruction in the cyber warfare arena. I wonder if such a strategy isn't a little bit adopting the strategies of the last wars in the next one. The assumptions associated with mutual assured destructions included the ability to identify accurately the people who attacked you and the assumption that they actually had something to lose. In the cyber warfare arena, it is often difficult, if not impossible, to identify who actually initiated an attack, and often if the people involved are non-state actors, they, by the very nature, perceive themselves of having nothing to lose.
Well, I think I either misstated or you misheard me. I don't think the mutually assured destruction applies very well in the cyber arena. I think but there's a broader way of looking at it. I mean, mutually assured destruction was one aspect of deterrence, but it was not the only one. And I think in the cyber world, there is the potential for deterrent models to apply, and particularly when you're dealing with other major nation states which do have something to lose. The ability to attribute, you're right, is harder in the cyber world than it is in the nuclear world. Missiles come with a return address. Cyber attacks do not. Nevertheless, we've gotten better at attribution, and if you're a major nation state, you're probably not going to bet the farm on the fact that we wouldn't be able to trace it back. So I think there is some deterrence, but the balance, I think, is more heavily towards defensive systems in the cyber world than it was in the nuclear world. You're going to rely more heavily on defenses, which is why I was stressing the need for active defenses, not just perimeter, Maginot line type defenses. And then you're absolutely right. There's a whole set of actors, which is what I was trying to stress in the talk, that worry me the most, more than nation states, which are those actors that have very little to lose, and therefore the deterrent model doesn't work at all with them. And there you absolutely need to deal with active defenses. You have to have ways of addressing those threats that don't involve just responding to them after they've happened. So I think I mostly agree with you, but I think there is a role in nation states for a deterrent model, and you need to play that, but you also need to recognize that attribution and other aspects make this quite different than the nuclear world. Sure, in the middle.
Is there any way that you could characterize of the three targets, the intellectual property, the military, and the critical infrastructure, which are more susceptible or easier for adversaries to go after? And is there anything you can do to characterize sort of the adversaries? Are these people onesie twosie, brilliant technology type people, or does it take a department with tons of equipment? What is the sort of the entry level and then the risk of the target that they're going after?
Well, in terms of capabilities, this is again different than the nuclear world. In the nuclear world, the barriers to entry are very substantial. You have to have a sophisticated technological enterprise to be able to do the design development and to have the precision to actually develop a weapon. Then you need an industrial base that's substantial to develop the material. If you're a terrorist or other group, your only option there is to steal it. You're never going to be able to develop it. The cyber world's not quite the same. To have a robust portfolio of cyber capabilities probably still resides in the realm of major nation states, major resource centers. But if for a few targeted weapons, it is very possible to develop world-class capabilities. I mean, a couple of dozen talented programmers in Silicon Valley, working in flip-flops and shorts and drinking Red Bull all night, can develop world-class capabilities. And we need, and that's hence one of my worries is that as we see the types of capabilities grow in degree of destructiveness, we're also going to see the availability to less and less structured, moves away from nation states towards rogue states, towards terrorist groups, towards even individual rogue actors. And so that it's that crossroads I was talking about is when that destructive capability meets that malicious actor. That's what we've most got to worry about. In the back.
In regard to talking about the private sector versus the public sector, you have private companies such as Kaspersky in Russia or Symantec in the United States that have taken a neutral stance when it comes to stopping cyber attacks or stopping malware that has been identified as being created by a foreign entity. How does that play out in the United States policy? Will we take a firm stance against American companies who create products that stop cyber attacks that maybe are not beneficial to have stopped for the United States?
It'd be hard to control the private sector in that regard. I thought you were going to go a different path. Again, staying with the nuclear model for a second, I mean, one of the things that I think doesn't apply in terms of the nuclear cyber analogy is the use of arms control, partly because of the difficulty of attribution, the ease with which cyber weapons can be developed. It's hard to develop mutual limitations on cyber weapons that would be meaningful. That said, I think there are other potential models of international regimes that might be helpful in this regard. And there's a public health model where everybody has an interest in limiting certain diseases and acts to do so. I think you could see international regimes where we could do the same thing in the cyber realm. Would that maybe limit, U.S. options? I think it might, but since the U.S. is more dependent on information technology in both its commercial and military sectors than any other nation, I think things that improve cybersecurity are going to generally, on balance, be in our national interest. So I think we ought to look at those kinds of regimes, those kinds of paradigms to try and improve security. But they're going to have to be in those more general law enforcement model, the public health model, versus the kind of the military arms control model. So over here.
I haven't been following this very closely, but I know that there's been a lot of controversy over acts like SOPA that have been going through Congress, and I was wondering if you could clarify to what extent you see the U.S.'s desire to protect the intellectual property of companies conflicting with the freedom of internet users.
There's a debate there in terms of kind of the providers of content and the ISPs and others. That's in my mind, that's a debate. There are equities on both sides. You need to work that out, and I think through the process you can develop a balance that gives both sides kind of 80% of what they need, and you can find your way through to that. What worries me more about Congress is that there's also legislation held up in Congress to improve public-private partnerships for sharing, for protecting critical infrastructure. I think that's a critical piece of legislation, and I think unfortunately it's become politicized. Maybe it's because we're so close to an election. But I think that's unfortunate because, as I said, I think we have a window of opportunity to act. I think part of that, the act that's needed here is legislation that allows these public-private partnerships, that protects private entities, that participate with the government from legal liabilities and restraint of trade and those kinds of things, that allows sharing of information. I think all of this is essential. I think I think there's some very good ideas in Congress that move along that, but unfortunately, they've run afoul of some outside opposition and some politicization, and I hope once we get past the election, we can get this legislation in place, because I think it's very important in terms of establishing the kind of protective regime I'm talking about. Coming down.
Again, thank you for coming and sharing your ideas. You mentioned a critical infrastructure, and one of the critical infrastructures that we never talk about, I think the ultimate critical infrastructure, are people. There's always the nut behind the wheel making the decision, whether in the military or in the private sector. What are your thoughts on how we address this challenge? Because whether it's WikiLeaks or anything else, these are people making mistakes, and it's really hard to build systems to prevent them from making mistakes and still allow them to do their job.
It's a different kind of problem. The problem that I focused my remarks on was really a remote threat, people coming across the internet and doing damage to our economy, to our military, to our industry. A different kind of threat is what you're talking about, is really kind of an insider threat, either intentional or not. That's a less existential threat in my mind. It's an important one, but and it takes it takes a different kind of process to work through that. In the WikiLeaks instance, it was, as we looked at it in the Department of Defense, it was largely bad process that allowed that. It was people either not having the right, we didn't even have the right regime in place, or where we did, people weren't following it. And there are fairly simple things that you can do that don't necessarily impede people's access to information. For example, in WikiLeaks, the most fundamental issue in WikiLeaks was we created a database that had everything in it, and once you got inside that database, you had access to everything. And so if you were in Iraq, you had access to arms control negotiations in Europe. Well, why did you need that? And so, just a simple step of compartmentalizing the information So if you're a warfighter in Iraq, you need the information that's related to that. You don't need the information on trade negotiations in Singapore or something. And so just simple steps that weren't done before but are being done now in terms of compartmentalizing information, ensuring that there's, in terms of accessing it, you have a two-key system. If you want to print something, you're not allowed, you can't print it alone. Somebody else has to be involved, so a lone actor can't. There are steps, just basic good hygiene that won't address the entire threat, but you can get 80 or 90% of that threat by just improving our processes. Ma'am.
I was curious if the fifth domain, the cyber domain, renders the other domains obsolete, and how will conventional Army strength hold in this war of the information age?
It doesn't render the other domains obsolete, but all of the other domains have become dependent on them. So that our ground domain is dependent on our ability to transmit information, to be able to use the internet, to use information technology, to develop, use sensors to develop the information and then provide it to the people that need it in a timely way. If, as I was indicating, it's a strength of the U.S. military that we do this better than anyone else by a fairly wide margin. It also becomes a vulnerability in that we have become dependent on that. And if you're able to somehow break those links, either by breaking the links themselves or sabotaging the data so you don't have confidence, there's a number of different ways to do it. It will have a very substantial impact on our warfighting capabilities. So it's in our very strong interest that we protect that fifth domain. But it's not because the other domains become obsolete, but it's how we actually operate in the other domains is by being effective in the fifth domain. Sir?
So obviously, I think in the next few years, the military is going to have some budget cuts, et cetera. And I think in the past, it's been pretty easy for citizens to quantify, okay, a tank will cost, X amount, and you add that up. But I don't know if you'll have an exact number on this. I guess just an estimate on what we'll be spending. But I mean, what does it cost to, outline this kind of a program where you're building things like a firewall rather than a tangible, I guess, good? Like it's just interesting. Basically, how much is this kind of a program going to cost versus what we've had with traditional warfare?
I mean, at this point, we're in the early stages of this, so the cost is not really substantial relative. It's substantial. But relative to the, $500 billion defense budget, we spend on cyber, I'd say, between $5 and $10 billion. It's much less than we spend on, planes, tanks, ships, and so on. And indeed, what we find, I think, and it's not surprising in a maturing area that you have this, that we run out of imagination before we run out of money. In other words, what are the key ideas, what are the technologies that are going to bring protections to the internet rather than how do we fund them. Now, ultimately, people will develop those ideas and we'll have those funding challenges, but that's not the point that we're at this time.
Should we be concerned about the fact that more and more of our electronics and software is produced offshore, so that what kind of national security risk that poses long term?
Yeah, we should be concerned, and I said that, I focused on one threat, which is the remote threat. The gentleman here raised another threat, it's kind of the insider threat. You're raising a third threat, which is the supply chain threat. How do you know that the equipment that you have, the servers, the laptops, whatever, aren't themselves compromised? It is a worry, and there are companies, Microsoft's particularly good at this, that have thought long and hard about this, because it's not just a security worry, it's a commercial worry as well. And there are things like randomization of delivery, so you don't know, if you don't know where the system of the server is going to go, it's hard to compromise them all, so you can't target. So there are techniques like that. We need to think about that. And you also need to think about, we're not alone in this world. There are other countries who are worried about us doing that to them too. So there's this this world that it cuts both ways. I think there are steps that we can take. I think we need to think about it. We particularly need to think about it for critical systems, whether they're in, fighters or nuclear power plants or whatever. You need to make sure that those kinds of systems aren't compromised, where the impact of a compromise could be catastrophic. But it's a problem to worry about, but I think there are steps that we can take. Let me let's go over here. Behind you.
Hello, my name is James. I'm a graduate student here. Excuse me. My home's in Melbourne Beach, Florida. And DRS is a very significant employer in the economy there. 25 years ago, 30 years ago, DRS's primary product was a digital recorder for ASW. Today, you're $1 billion plus, a much larger corporation with a much larger parent company. In an era of declining defense budgets, how are you going to maintain that growth?
Well, like every defense company, we're looking at the challenge of either a flat or declining defense budget. There's no silver bullet magic solution. You have to, I think, try and stabilize your core businesses at an appropriate level, which we're trying to do. You need to look to adjacent areas. We're actually quite strong in Homeland Security, which is a growing area as opposed to some others. We have some opportunities internationally. In Asia and the Middle East, the defense budgets are going different directions than ours. And then there are commercial opportunities. And that's the highest challenging one. There's Norm Augustine, who is the former CEO of Lockheed, has famously said that the introduction of defense companies into the commercial arena is unblemished by success. So and a lot of defense companies lost a lot of money in the 90s and thereafter trying to get into commercial arenas. And we're looking at it, but you have to be conscious that we're used to dealing with a very complicated customer, but a single customer. We don't have channels to market the way commercial companies do. We have to understand that in the defense business, most of the risk and development is paid for by the government. Where in the commercial arena, you're doing that on your own dime, and you get higher margins in exchange for that. But you have to think about how do you make that return on investment work. So you have to think in a different way, and so we're trying to do that. We're trying to do it carefully so we don't become a victim to Augustine's law.
What I was wondering is, when it comes to non-state actors, how never mind, sorry. How intertwined are our information networks globally for them not to be affected if we were to retaliate against a cyber attack? For example, if, let's say, a terrorist group launches a cyber attack where our financial sector goes down, what sector from the country that was in charge of that or that helped that terrorist group, what sector from that country will we attack in a way that it becomes an isolated attack that does not trigger a chain reaction where if that sector's, let's say, financial network goes down, it brings down other networks with it?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, the financial sector is a particularly tricky one because it has become so electronic. And people have faith in the system right now. And you probably do your banking online, and you probably pay your tuition online. If people lose faith in that system, that somehow your record of paying the tuition or that your bank account is now uncertain, you're going to fundamentally change your behavior, or you potentially would, or enough people would, that it would have a hugely damaging impact on our whole economy. That foundational element could be at risk. So I think we have to be very, very careful. I think what we want to see is the financial sector to not be part of any kind of, I was talking about, establishing international norms, a public health regime. I think it would be in the interests of most major nation states to see their financial sectors, whatever other differences we might have with other countries. I think we might be able to agree with almost all of them that it would be better for all of us to have a secure financial sector. So that is part of the reason that leads me down this road of active defense. So, retaliation may not be the right response and that kind of thing. What you'd rather do is block it from happening at all, to keep people's faith in the system, so that you need to be able to, as I say, hunt on those networks. You need to be able to see attacks as they come, divert them. This is why I talk about public-private partnership. An important part of that partnership is what the government brings is intelligence capabilities. So you use those intelligence capabilities to anticipate, preempt, block those attacks before they arrive. Now, it's not going to work every time, but this has to be a layered approach. So you try and preempt and block as many as you can, divert those that get there, and minimize the ones that get through. I mean, you have to work it at every level. Turn the back.
Thanks. I'm a big believer in protecting critical infrastructure, and I agree with your talk, but I want to kind of challenge a little bit, which is on the fifth dimension of cyber, that seems to have more potential to bleed into the rest of our social world than thinking about defense of the air and the sea and land. Although I don't know, that's not my area of expertise. So just even the comment that you just made, I like the idea of public-private partnerships because that means a sharing. But one person's attack a threat is another person's social movement or social activist or critic of the government. So that line seems to potentially be blurred more in cyber. And how do we think about that when we clearly have to pay attention to cybersecurity and improve our ability to secure this arena, and yet protect our civil liberties and the issues we also care about?
No, it's a very good question. I mean, at one level, I mean, without, I guess, naming countries, but there are countries who see cybersecurity as being suppression of challenges to the government, basically suppressing free speech. They see that as a security issue. Now, that's obviously not what I'm talking about, but you're right. When you get into international discussions with some of these states, that's exactly where they go, and we don't agree with it, although I think they're genuine in their belief. What I'm trying to do to deal with that less on the international stage and more on the national stage is the other part of your question, which is the public-private. It is different than the other domains. It's different. Most of the internet is in private hands. It's not a government, it's not a government entity. The government doesn't own it. So obviously it has to be a partnership. That said, I think that you end up with a concept of public good here in that it's not, you're not going to have, individual power companies or individual transportation companies, or whatever. It may not be in their economic interest to put in the kinds of defenses that the country might need in order to ensure that we have the full power grid and that we have the appropriate protections for that. So you have to have some kind of role for the government in that. And so I think that's the challenge is it doesn't swing all the way. This is not a problem like air defense, where you probably can have just a military government role. But it's not purely private. It's not a law enforcement problem. It is a national security problem. But that's why I've limited it when I've talked about it. I'm talking about critical infrastructure. I don't think that the government at all has, certainly not the federal government, has the same role in protecting you from cyber theft from that guy in Nigeria who keeps sending you those emails. That isn't a national security issue. The power grid going down, a nuclear plant going out, those are national security issues. I think there's actually a discrete number of entities. Now, you're going to get into gray areas, but I think you can go down the critical infrastructure, you know, their power, their financial, their transportation, its communications, you can identify the nodes in that need to be protected with, you know, 80, 90% confidence. And I think that's the road that we need to go down. You are going to end up with some blurry areas, but that's, you know, the fun of government. You're going to have to figure that out. And I think it's very much in the industry's interest that we do that, and it's certainly in our national security interest that we do that. Let me come over here.
With the recent capture of a stealth drone by Iran, I guess there were some reports that it was hijacked electronically. I guess the Iranian government argued that. How carefully do you think we're approaching automation on the battlefield?
I think that report was denied. I think it just crashed. But I don't worry as much about unmanned systems as I think that it may be generically worried in that even if you have a man in the cockpit or a woman in the cockpit, they are just as dependent on information technology systems as if they were in, you know, Maryland. You know, they got one more communications link, but all of the sensors, all of the data, they're all coming through information systems. So you are depending on this information technology world. You are depending on these sensors. The location of who's flying the thing is not, I think, central to how you control it.
You mentioned offensive cyber capabilities being a key deterrent, and you didn't mention Stuxnet and the effect on the Iranian nuclear program. And I was wondering how many such offensive threats are being turned away by U.S. defensive systems currently, or how inclement is that threat in impacting our critical infrastructure? Would you anticipate a major breach in the near term?
Well, near term, no, but it depends on how you define near term. But as I indicated, I think we're escalating up. Stuxnet's kind of the leading edge of that third stage. There's not much out there like that, but what it shows is that can happen, and when it can happen, it will. And so, but most of, you know, I can't remember what I used to put in speeches, the number of attacks we had today. I can't remember what it is in the Pentagon, but it's, you know, we get, I think, hundreds of thousands of intrusions in a day, and, you know, maybe a few hundred are serious. But most of those are still in that realm of, they're not Stuxnet, like they're exploitation. People are trying to get information. People are trying to steal data. They're trying to steal secrets. My fear is, and I think more than fear, is that we're going to keep moving up that ladder, and as we do, the threat then grows.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, you'll have noticed that my presence on the stage compels me to dispatch my reluctant duty of bringing these proceedings to a close. I hope you'll join me in thanking Bill Lynn for his excellent comments and remarks.
Good. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks.